There we go. I'm so happy to be joined this morning by Reverend Dr. Mae Cannon. She is Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. And Mae, welcome to this conversation. And please tell us more about your work, your mission, your passion, and where you are situated.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a while since we've had the opportunity to connect across the Atlantic. And so I'm a pastor ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church, one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women. And so as we look at this moment in US history, one of the things that's kind of directly manifested in my life is a lot of these divisions. You know, the evangelical church is said to support the Trump administration. Well, I'm a social justice advocate who's written several books about that. And so I'm not quite in alignment with the conservative evangelicals that are getting so much attention in the news around our political climate in the US. So I consider myself an avocational academic. I've written several books. I have a couple of doctorates, but my primary vocation is working on mobilizing the church to engage constructively in the Middle East through Churches for Middle East Peace.
May, I think our viewers or listeners may be interested in that particular, in your organization as such. And we're going to get to the relationship between faith and politics just now, because that is a passion for both of us. Let's call it public theology, for lack of a better phrase. But just in terms of the Middle East and the peace processes there. I mean, just recently there was some big news, that your previous president, achieved these miraculous things in terms of Middle East peace. And many people who consume that kind of news aren't familiar with the complexities. So what would your view be on that, for example, on what happened there and your role as an organization that's involved in the Middle East peace process?
Sure. So we work with whoever's in the White House. It doesn't matter if they're Republican or if they're Democrat. We worked very closely with the Obama administration, had significant access. Often we'll travel to the Middle East, or we have partners that are churches or peace building organizations. And so we will inform the US government about things that we care about and about needs of the church, and educating about some of the realities on the ground. So we have staff there as well. But under this administration, the Trump administration, there have been too many to count detrimental policies towards the Middle East. The moving of the Jerusalem embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, one of the first major countries in the world to do so, which was acknowledging Jerusalem as the unilateral capital of Israel, which completely neglects to acknowledge any of the claims of Palestinians. And international law would say East Jerusalem, should be a part of the future Palestinian state. So that's just one example, but cutting funding to the Palestinians. Most recently, the US government, through the State Department, has decided to identify products made in Israeli settlements as being made in Israel to attempt to move forward on the annexation of parts of the West Bank becoming Israel proper. And if people are familiar with the conflict, in Europe, they do the exact opposite. They label settlement products so that people can make informed decisions to not further perpetuate this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So I could go into as much detail as you'd like about the policies. The way we describe it in DC is that the Trump administration has broken a lot of China. Like a bull in a china shop. And in terms of US policies vis-a-vis the Middle East, the China was never in great shape anyway. We haven't had a great history in that regard. But now there's all this glass broken, and it's a lot harder to put glass back together again than it is to break it. So our fear is the Biden administration is inheriting this mess of foreign policy. What are they going to do? And are they going to have the appetite to reverse some of this broken China?
Sure. So it seems as if your work and your challenges as organization, they're just going to get more and more. And from this side of the world, at least, we are wishing you well, as we are also coping with our own challenges. May, what is striking to me in what you're saying is you know, and obviously I'm listening with, you know, a certain filter in my ear and certain lenses. And just in the sort of undercurrent that you are talking about, there's that thing about, let's call it supremacy, you know. So just in terms of Israel and the Jewish-Palestinian conflict, you know, there's this idea, and I mean, on some levels, there's a lot of understanding for where those notions come from, that one group deems itself, you know, above another. But that brings us to the whole sort of, one of the issues that is so pertinent in our time, and you know, the reason why we're having this conversation as a South African and an American is because of the almost the resonance between the two contexts, you know, the American one and the South African one. I mean, I don't know if you know, but with George Floyd, I mean, in South Africa, there was a huge sort of awareness because it struck so many chords in our context. So in terms of how people are sort of grouped together and how people organize themselves, I mean, that is all politics, right? And you wrote in a recent article, you said, we must stop making the false assumption that politics and our faith aren't intimately connected. And I would love you to say more about that, because many Christians, not all of them, but many, and dare I say, good Christians, they say to me, they would come to me and say, Reverend, but you must not mix politics and religion. They are two separate things. Please, what is your view?
Yes, well, I'll start with that word that you mentioned, and I think you mentioned it in the context of Israel and the Palestinian conflict. You talked about power, and I think it's really important to understand, like in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or I'll speak about my own backyard in the US context, if we're not acknowledging differentials in power, we won't be able to address systemic issues within society. So our approach to the Middle East and to the Palestinian crisis is to say we want to have a holistic perspective towards peace that honors all of the people of the land. It's multi-narrative. We don't want to minimize, you know, the perspective of any group of people while emphasizing human rights and justice, you know, and calling for an addressing of the abuse of power, you know, in different contexts when it happens. And in the US, that's what's been happening and what's kind of come to the surface. I would describe it, I don't know if you have dandelions in South Africa, but we have these weeds that grow in our front yards called dandelions. And they have these roots that you can rip off the top and never get to the roots. And I feel like racism in the US is that type of a problem. It's been here since the establishment of our country. White supremacy has been assumed, and at times, like in this moment of history, it's bubbling over where, you know, the statements that are being made publicly that are so ardently racist are being accepted in society in a way that in the 80s or 90s, you know, they would not. And so how does that relate to faith and politics? Your question, you know, often in the church here, well-minded people who love Jesus, who are Christians, believe that their social engagement with society is separate from their faith in Christ. So the most important thing of their faith is attending church, the communion of saints in terms of fellowship, reading the Bible, personal piety, prayers, their relationship with God. And they look at their political engagement as being, you know, in kind of a different category. And I think it's critically important for those of us who choose to follow Jesus and for those of us who read the Bible to understand that that was not Jesus's perspective. I mean, Jesus didn't ignore the injustice of the Roman Empire. You know, and there's case by case when in the parables, when Jesus talks about responding to injustice, you know, when the soldier asks you to carry his garment 1 mile, walk with him 2, is a direct affront to a political injustice that Jesus is responding to that has to do with power and setting things right. So at least in the US context, we have this whole idea of separation of church and state. And the idea is, you know, you're faithful on one hand and then you engage in society on the other. And I just would return us to Jesus's message of love your neighbor is not an apolitical command. It actually demands that we engage constructively in our politics.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I know the kind of how-to questions are very difficult. But I mean, how do you see that happening sort of in practice? I mean, do you have access, for example, to congregations or denominations that are eager to have that conversation about power? Because a friend of mine over here calls that the deep work. He speaks about the deep work. So to actually sit with somebody who calls him or herself a follower of Jesus, well, I do the same, but they, as you've described it so well, they have this sense of, sort of personal or private piety, separating those arenas. How do you think that happens? And in your experience, I mean, what is the appetite for that?
I think it depends where you are on the spectrum in terms of the appetite. I think there are a lot of conservatives in the US who are very afraid, and they've been carrying this fear. And I believe when we have pain or when we have things that cause us discomfort, if we don't have constructive outlets for that, which is transformation, so if we're not transformed into the image of Christ, that type of anxiety comes out sideways. It comes out in ways that are not constructive. And so the appetite kind of depends on the place and the people. But there are some incredible churches that are all white churches that are entering into seasons of lament. I had the privilege of co-writing a book called Forgive Us, Confessions of a Compromised Faith, that looks at the history of the US context and calls us to ownership and repentance of ways that we've inherited benefit. Even if we were not directly complicit in some of the sins of the church, we inherit the system of it and the benefit of it. And so you have churches, I'm talking about white communities in particular, that are taking this moment very seriously to say, where are we in proximity with people who are suffering? Where are we in proximity with people of color who may look differently than we? Where are we taking responsibility for benefits that we have from white supremacy, from white privilege? Where are we repenting, which doesn't just mean asking for forgiveness, it means actually changing our methodology. And where are we even trying to make right power differentials by giving power away or by sharing power? And so those are all places where I see things happening, in the church, in different places across the US.
Well, I can only hope and pray that those stories will be shared, and those, almost the insights and the discoveries about, sort of living together and growing in those processes. Because I mean, that's a fascinating thing. I mean, perhaps that's another topic for another time as well, to talk about that sort of transformation of pain. That and again, there's sort of very, very striking resonance with contexts around the world, but most definitely with the South African context. May, I would like to just ever so slightly change the angle at which, from which we look at all this, and ask you about, I mean, you are on social media, you have a smartphone, we live in this sort of hyper-connected world, where for several years now, the whole idea of truth has been quite a topic and a thing. I mean, a couple of years ago, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year was post-truth. I mean, given your current events around the presidential election and the way that campaigns were rolled out, etc., I mean, what is your view on, Christians, for example, saying, but here's a set of truths, here's another set, and you are lying. And, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, just that incredibly difficult dynamic around truth. Any perspectives on that?
What grieves me the most is when there are communities of well-meaning people, often people of faith, many times Christians, who are either disconnected from a problem, they don't have proximity to a problem or to people. And so then these communities formulate very strong ideas or beliefs that they hold on to like sacred truth, and yet it's an ill-informed or only a partially informed. So part of the problem is there is some truth, regardless of where you are in the US context across politics. Some of the Republican concerns are legitimate concerns, you know, or the idea that the Democrats are the only ones who care about the poor. Well, that's not true. Republicans care about the poor, many of them at least, but they have different ideas about the ways we should respond to the poor. And so, you know, I heard a statistic recently that more people in the United States will get married across religious divides than political divides. Like, we are so divided in our country that if you're Republican, many times you won't know someone who's a Democrat, or vice versa. And so the further away we get from each other, the more entrenched we are in our own truths and our own perspective, and the more isolated we are. And I think the only way we can respond to that is by proximity, by exposing ourselves to people with whom we disagree, and not exposing ourselves like condemning them or being brash in our engagement, but by seeking to understand where they're coming from, which I don't think means compromising on injustice. I mean, I'm in a lot of communities where I'm one of the few or only white allies. They're communities of color. And one of the things we hear from communities of color in the US right now is enough is enough, enough learning, enough patience, you know, enough racism. You know, the time now to address these injustices is now, which I completely agree with. And at the same time, I think that there are people who just haven't been exposed, or just, you know, I've had some meetings with the Trump administration at the White House, particularly in the vice president's office, where the people with whom I met are the most well-meaning Christians who believe their own lies. And forgive me for saying that, they don't think they're lying, but like, they fundamentally, I left the meeting kind of expecting to be frustrated, or, you know, expecting to think that they're terrible people because they're doing such terrible things in the Middle East. The exact opposite was the case. They really believe that they're saving the world, right? And my perspective is they're actually causing much damage to the world, right? But they fundamentally believe that. And so how do you kind of break through those divisions? And as the divisions become more entrenched or further apart, you know, how do we seek to speak truth or bring light in darkness? Those are the questions I think are the most relevant, you know, at least for the administration that will be in place until January.
Yeah, most definitely so. Most definitely so. May, I think just on that last remark of yours, I mean, I take from it, you know, the value of embodied conversations. And obviously, you know, this year with the pandemic, you know, it's been a theme for all of us, you know, that we, I mean, I don't know if you know, but in South Africa, from the third week in March, we've had different stages of lockdowns, where at times we were not permitted to leave our homes at all. You know, so that the whole thing about proximity has become such an issue. You know, and we haven't been helped by communicating on these things alone. You know, they've been a lifeline, and it's been wonderful that we are not disconnected in that sense. But the value of embodied conversations is so poignantly highlighted by your remarks. So, May, I mean, a sort of a response to that, perhaps?
You know, I think on one hand, we're so much more isolated, and on the other, we connect across divides we never would have connected across, because, you know, I can't fly to see you. So, you know, at least in our relationships in the Middle East, we're almost more connected to a broader community in the Middle East. It's a little less embodied, it's two-dimensional. We're very eager to be able to physically be together.
You're back.
Disappeared for a minute, it seems. But I think, to your point, what does embodiment look like until we get to the other side of COVID? And in the meantime, two-dimensional is a wonderful way to, you know, build initial relationships. And then once we're able to physically be together, you know, and to engage in service and action and fellowship and all of those types of things, you know, I think that will be the next step once we're on the other side of this horrific virus, the Lord willing.
Maybe that should just be how we end this conversation. Just sort of a few general remarks about the pandemic and COVID and what it's like at the moment in the US, because I mean we are watching those numbers and they are quite dramatic. So
Yeah, it's scary.
yeah.
That's right. I think COVID is a game changer for a lot of people who had no reserves. It's the tipping point to put them over the line of desperation. Just, you know, families that didn't have financial reserves, or individuals who've lost their jobs. And, you know, for the people who are the under-resourced, I wrote an article, you know, a lot of news outlets in the US were saying COVID doesn't discriminate. The rich and the poor get sick. And I wrote an article that said COVID does discriminate. Let's just be clear. The devastating effects of COVID are the worst for people who are marginalized in society, you know, which happens to be communities of color. We're having major issues with a number of Asian Americans, many of whom have been American for 5 or 6 generations, but where they're experiencing racism in a new way because President Trump called the virus the China virus, right? So I have Korean American friends who are not even Chinese, but who have had, you know, people spit at them or people just react in horrific ways, you know, because of those dynamics, which I think are absolutely true. But, you know, for me, and Rudy, I didn't tell you this before we started, I had a horrific loss that is COVID related. My brother struggled with schizophrenia and struggled with a combination of drug abuse and schizophrenia. And in May, he took his life in large part because services that he needed access to were closed because of COVID. And so when I talk about that line of desperation, it's not just a metaphysical line. I'm talking about a physical line between life and death, where people are losing their lives, not just because of sickness, but because the desperation is so severe, which I hope is a call for our communities to not stop caring for your neighbor. Check in by phone, you know, check in healthy and safe ways. With people who don't have family, or, you know, with people who are part of your community that might not have sustainable work. I think that's a way we can come together, you know, while we try to ride out this horrific virus.
Absolutely, May. Just from my side, you know, condolences in terms of your loss, and you know, with your, you know, that sharing of yours and the reference to the marginalized. Again, you know, in our context, so many similarities, so many. It's almost overwhelming. But your emphasis and your remark on sort of almost a call to action, a call to care, a call to reaching out, a call to communities to sort of almost reorientate themselves, ourselves. That is what I'll be taking from this conversation as well. So with the deepest gratitude and the best wishes to you and your people and your organization, Churches for Middle East Peace, and all the work you do, may you be blessed abundantly. May you be energized and hopeful to continue this work. And may, yes, thank you for your precious time. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Wonderful to be with you, and blessings to you and yours and your community as well.
Thank you, May. Thank you.